We are rolling.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for accommodating us and being willing to talk with us. I appreciate it a lot.
Pleasure.
It's like we did on the phone. What I would like to do is to start off by saying, let's spend 5 minutes or something, 10 minutes, and give a thumbnail. I always like this, how somebody comes into their work, right? So that we understand the lens, how the lens formed that you see through and you learn through. And then from there, we'll go into specifics of the work.
Right. Well, I was initially interested in speech and cognition, the relationship between language and thought. This is a historic problem. Every psychologist worked on that, beginning about 1840, really, until recently. But it did occur to me at one point that children's learning to read could be just as significant for their cognition as their learning to talk. And seeing there were already so many people working on speech and thought, I thought, I'll have a look at writing and thought. But I was led to this by reading two important papers, one by Marshall McLuhan, actually, our own Marshall McLuhan, and one by Jack Goody, who's an anthropologist at Cambridge. I would say the paper with Goody, that he'd written with Ian Watt at Stanford, was the paper that made me think that it might be possible to do some interesting research on what happens to children's thinking when they learn to read. Not just the skill of reading, but the cognitive implications of reading. So I started to do some experiments. The first thing I looked at was their ability to distinguish what was said from what was meant. And that worked out very nicely when children are about 5 or 6. Just when they're learning to read, they start to become more conscious of the exact words they used. As we now say, they became meta-linguistically aware. They were talkers all along, but they started to realize that their talk was made up of things like words, and that words could be organized into things like sentences and so on. So for roughly 20 years, I suppose, I explored aspects of children's interpretation of what they had read and their ability to put their thoughts down or what they'd said down into written form. It's a massively difficult transformation. Children are quite capable of telling you what they think, but if you ask them to write down what they think, it's an entirely new activity, entirely new set of demands. And so is the problem of interpreting printed documents. It's one thing to understand what you're told because of its contextual relevance and its pragmatic utility and so on. But to understand what's written down in a document, in a text of some sort, is quite a different thing. Not only in terms of decoding the words and so on, but of just grasping what's going on in a written document. What's it for? Who said it? What did they mean by it? All these sorts of issues become central to children's thinking as they become acquainted with written documents. I would say another word about Jack Goody. Jack Goody is an anthropologist who was primarily interested in the social implications of literacy. What happens to a society when everything's done by means of writing? And I'm very interested in that because that's what schooling is all about. My later work has been on schooling because it's very much a documentary process. Well, Jack Goody was very good on the social implications of writing, the uses of writing in different social and cultural contexts. But my work tried to say, well, what are the psychological implications of writing? So my work isn't just a copy of Jack Goody's, although it was sponsored by it or encouraged by it. But whereas Goody had looked more at the cultural and social side, I looked more at the psychological and cognitive side of writing.
The developmental side of what happens to a human being as they come into this.
Exactly. What happens? They're already talkers. Does anything change when they start to be writers and readers rather than just talkers? That's the question.
And this, to some degree, this seems like a great place to be between Goody and McLuhan, in that he seems to be two polarities that you're right between.
Right. McLuhan's psychological theories were incredibly interesting, but I never could make much use of them. For example, the idea that it's visual rather than auditory, the sense modality is what's critical. That might be true, but I never found a way to turn that into a feasible research program. So I treat that more as a metaphor for thinking about
But his notion about medium, that certainly
That's
kicks
right.
in.
That's
yeah.
right. That the medium itself is maybe just as important as the information being conveyed. That's right. That's what allows you to think about writing, the implications of writing as opposed to just the implications of speaking. That's right. It's the medium of representation that is, I wouldn't say it's just as important as the content, but it's perhaps equally important, and it can be distinguished from the content to some extent. So you can talk about being a writer without talking about being a writer of what. Now, the recent research in this field, however, has moved in the direction of saying that being a writer is not as general a competence as one would think. That being a writer of legal documents is just totally different than being a writer or a reader of scripture, which in turn is entirely different than being a writer of friendly letters and so on. So the move in more or less cultural psychology has been to say, writer of what? To whom? And then talking about the different modes of writing, the different audiences, the different uses in different cultural contexts and so on. And arguing that you can be skilled at one of these things and still not be able to do another. That reading is a general competence to the extent that it means you can decode the text, know the rules for formation of sentences from utterances. But beyond that, you get into content issues. Like reading science is not the same as reading literature.
It's all context.
That's all context. That's right. The context. And the context defines a kind of competence too. You see, to write a scientific document, I've studied these too to some extent, requires a different way of using writing than, say, writing friendly letters. You know, you really are obliged to know the genre, as we say. What makes a scientific document? You probably remember your experiences as a student when you first encountered alternative forms of documents. Like reading a piece of history, when you begin, seems like a totally alien kind of writing. And reading scientific articles, of course, is a different thing again. You know, you have to make different assumptions about your readers. You have to assume what they already know, what everyone in the field already knows. You have to set out your argument in a particular way. You know, all of these things you have to do in writing, but you also have to be able to recognize them in the reading of those documents. And they're specialized skills. So I would say an ongoing question, a current ongoing question, is the extent to which literacy may be thought as a general competence, which is what test makers like to think that it is, and to what extent literacy is a set of specialized competencies tied to particular domains of social activity, like sermons as opposed to law, as opposed to science, as opposed to public magazines and so on.
Right. So at one level you could say there's all of this differentiation that becomes context specific, where you could almost say the medium is the message, the context is the message. There's this effect that happens as literacy differentiates, but all literacies, including all of their specializations and differentiations, are different than non-literate.
Exactly, exactly. Now, that's also worth talking about in a little more detail, because a written document, say a legal document, is not a totally new form. It rides on a cultural practice of legal judgments. So Sharia law, which tends to be more of an oral tradition, and common law, which tends to be more of an oral tradition, is assimilated into document legal traditions. And the same with science. You can say that literacy created science, and there's a certain truth to that. Science, or take the more clearly argued case about history. History begins with written records. But in a sense, there was history before written records. But history does change when you start to use documents. And science absolutely changed when it came to rely on written documents. When you wrote up your reports in particular ways that other people could follow the exact procedure and do it in their own laboratories and so on, science changed. So there's this interesting relationship between a tradition that's already ongoing, like say economics, politics. There's always been politics. There's always been law of a sort. But these functions change dramatically when they get taken up by literate practices, keeping records, keeping documents, consulting existing documents, revising them to meet the requirements of a particular genre, particular structures of arguments and so on.
And when there's a reference that's not depending on somebody's particular memory.
That's right. The knowledge gets, I think that in traditional societies, let me step back. When I talk about traditional societies, this has often been talked about as the difference between oral societies and literate societies. It's a very important distinction because that's the big distinction that you're making. But the current work in this field shows that these boundaries are very permeable, so that written traditions, as one anthropologist pointed out, are really the most oral traditions. The people with the written tradition are the people who talk and argue all the time. The writers and readers are the ones who do most of the talking. So you'd have thought if orality and literacy are just two different things, the oral culture would be talking all the time, and the written culture would be sitting in your room reading silently. Well, it's not the case. Written documents rely on oral practices to a remarkable extent. And even oral practices, like in oral traditions, have devices that serve some of the same functions that writing does in a written tradition. Means of keeping, preserving information through time. The oral poets arguably were the people who were in charge of the memory function for the culture. They remembered what happened. Canadian Indian traditions are very good on this too. There were the people who knew the past. About 1750 or so, they started to write down a chronicle, one little thing for each year, because they had a writing system. Didn't write much of their history, but they could still tell what happened in 1750, 1751, 1752, and so on, as they began to keep these written records. So functions change with writing. And my interest in, as is I think yours, how did those functions change? But it would be wrong to think that writing created the function. It creates new functions to some extent, like say schools are a new function. But there are ways of passing on parents' skills to the young even before there were schools. Right. So it's always embedded in a cultural context.
As you were talking, I remembered the Greeks, in the sense that even though we think of them as being an early literate society, they were primarily oral, and they used a rememberer in their courts to act as the historian, so to speak, to interpret what was going on rather than records per se.
That's right. There's a wonderful book by Mary Carruthers called The Book of Memory, I believe it's called. The Book of Memory, on people who were skilled at memorizing everything. And she points out that the primary use of books in this culture, this is more or less monastic culture, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. The primary use of books was to check your memory. You used the book till you memorized it, then you set the book aside, and then you started to think. You see, rather than using the book as the medium of thinking, which is how we use them now, they were used mostly as means of checking memory.
But that seems perfectly natural given the economy of scale differences. Yeah? I mean, when books are so rare that you can have that many of them, then you'd use books in an entirely different way than if you could get at a book anytime you wanted to.
Exactly. And the availability of books is something that is of terrific importance and not well recognized. I've just been reading a book on the history of education, schooling in the province of Ontario in Canada here. And the most remarkable thing for me in that book was the fact that schools were extremely heterogeneous until about 1855, something like that. What went on in one school was completely different from what went on in another, although all schools had some commitment to reading and writing and doing arithmetic. But what happened about 1850 was that Canadian publishers began to publish textbooks that were cheap so that every kid could have a book in the classroom. And they published them at different levels of complexity. And within a decade, every school in Ontario, 4,000 of them at the time, was using the same set of readers, grading the children at the 4 levels, the beginning school and so on. The 4th reader was more or less the highest that they offered. But the availability of the textbooks made the schools completely uniform across the entire province of Ontario. And the same, of course, was happening in every other country at the same time. The printing press, which made documents readily available and cheap, meant that you could organize schools on the basis of them, and all schools more or less became the same, relying on these textbooks with a fixed content and so on.
Here again, we've got this technology creating this reference for how we're doing things.
That's right. That's right. And the technology...
One moment, please. Sorry, I need you to move the light box. I've got a shadow that's coming up, so when he's talking,
I see.
He's top lip. Can you move that over so we
Sure.
Thank you.
Start at that point?
Sure.
Yes, when we're talking about the printing press and textbooks and so on, the amazing impact that the availability of printed texts had, we should acknowledge that printing is a technology, but so is the alphabet. The alphabet is a technology in the sense that it's a contrived device for conveying information in a peculiar, specialized way. The alphabet and writing can't be reduced to speaking. It uses the same language, but all writing systems in the world are representations of a language. They're not means of communicating ideas directly. They tend to reflect the phonological properties of the speakers who use that writing system. There are exceptions, like the numerals for number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the written numerals, the Arabic numerals, as we say. It's a form of writing too, which is not phonological. And interestingly, that's much easier to read than our alphabets. And they say that Chinese characters are also easier to read. It's just that there are so many of them that it makes the problem of learning more difficult.
A different challenge in terms of the kind of rote memory that's required in order to get up in the system,
Right.
compared to the combinatoric properties that the alphabet
Exactly,
tries to. Yeah.
exactly. I was going to say a word about McLuhan,
Yes.
who was, as I said, one of the people who sort of sponsored in me the idea that maybe writing is important. And certainly to reread McLuhan is one of the most bracing intellectual experiences a person can have. He's absolutely dazzling. Where he got his ideas from, I'll never know. But his books, especially The Gutenberg Galaxy, is just full of exciting ideas. The problem is, of course, it's difficult to turn these speculations into a robust theory. And as a result, McLuhan has been more or less sidelined in most serious analysis of, say, writing and printing or technological change. Somewhat unfairly, because McLuhan did get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to credit the man for bringing out awareness of media.
Yes.
Which is incredibly critical and timely in the evolution of things, it would seem to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
The idea took hold in a frantic or furious kind of way in the 60s. And now I think everyone grants that the media are terrifically important and that we shouldn't just think they're conveyances for information. They are really devices for restructuring cognition and restructuring society. Like, think of how computers restructure society. Putting a man on the moon and things of that sort, which would simply be unthinkable without computer technology. Well, the writing systems and the printing press, I think, have been similarly dramatic.
Yeah, also, I mean, it seems like you couldn't conceive of the computer that's necessary to put the man on the moon unless you started with a more fundamental code.
I think that's right. You might not need phonological writing, our alphabets. There might have been a society that had just invented numerals and then took that into computers and so on. But I don't think so. It's certainly the case that writing is the thing that...
It seems like there would be a need for a certain level of complex, descriptive language that the numerals wouldn't get to, and that, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, probably no point in speculating about that.
Yeah.
Because the fact is that the invention of a writing system, and then the adoption of writing systems around the world, has been the thing that gives our modern societies their predominant character, I would say. And certainly computer science grows out of that in our society. Whether history could have run another way, we'll never know.
I mean, when you think, I mean, whereas we may say that writing and literacy didn't cause these things, almost everything about how they do function has been affected by them. I mean, politics, law, science. I mean, as you were talking about science, I mean, science emerged to be a community practice, the medium of which is writing.
No, I think that's right. The way I say it is in terms of a documentary process, like law too, a documentary process. The thing that you can do is consult the document and see if anything has changed. If you're relying on people's remembered events, you don't have a document to consult and you don't know whether things have changed in the meantime. So the documentary process is absolutely
Plus you're limited to same time, same place. In the case of the Renaissance, for example, when science is beginning to percolate, I mean, they have the ability to write something down and share it all over the place, as opposed to being in the same room at the same time with the rememberer.
Right. Actually, the predominant theories about writing, which I think are true, and they express what you've just suggested, are that writing provided a means of communication through time and across space. And I think that's fundamentally true. But that does hide to some extent the fact that it's not just a means of communication. What gets communicated changes in the act of communicating it across space and through time. So, for example, to write a document that's to be read 10 years from now, or, for even 10 days from now, you have to think about the object that you're describing in a different way than if you're just sharing it with someone in the particular context at the particular moment. So the message changes, and that's been the difficult trick in the study of writing, is to say exactly what changed. In general terms, you can say, well, you consulted things, you can consult the document, you can say you have to be explicit, which for some kinds of writing you do, but it has been an ongoing research program, I would say, to say just what exactly do you have to do differently because you're writing and reading than what you had to do when you were a speaker.
Mm-hmm. In terms of a kind of consciousness that's forecasting a assumptive reader and the context of interpretation and all of those levels. Yeah.
I have an example in one of my articles of two first-grade children who are writing a story, and the one was writing and the other one was advising, and the first girl puts down, "She came into the room," and the other girl says, "You can't say she." And the first girl says, "Why can't you say she?" Because they're talking about the teacher or something. "She came into the room late," or something of this sort. And the first girl, "No, you can't say she, because they won't know who she is." Now, who's the they that she suddenly is conscious of? A reader that won't know what that pronoun refers to. So you have to be explicit about what it refers to. But this all has to be thought out. This does not come automatically to a writer or a reader. This is something that has to be thought through, confronted, and learned.
So implicitly then, using this technology requires us to develop different kinds of constructs about future interactions with people not present in order to do it.
Yes, and especially, and this is the topic that I think is the most interesting new topic to enter the field, is consciousness of what a reader will make of these documents. And the recognition that even an author who does their best to make it clear what they want the reader to know can't guarantee that will happen. Readers will read it for their own purposes. And so the history of reading is really one of the most fascinating current topics, because you can take exactly the same texts and a different generation of readers will see something quite different in the same documents. This is what makes the legal system and the Supreme Court judgments always quite interesting. I mean, they're supposed to be interpreting the Constitution, which of course they're doing. But there is no such thing as enacting the meaning of the Constitution, because it'll be seen and read and interpreted in different ways depending on the situation, the context, the historical period you're working in, and so on. So the problem of reading is an absolutely fascinating one.
That particular point really tickles me in that people use the words, I mean, even in this morning's interview, it was like, if it's going to be down on paper, it has an objectivity to it, right? We even use the word frequently, literally true.
Yes.
Right? As if that makes it true. It's now in this objective form. And what you're saying, though, is that the meaning isn't objectively there.
No, there is something that's objectively there, and that's why writing is important.
Yes.
So you can consult the document, but what you see in the document is just as dependent on what you bring to the document as is the interpretation of speech, dependent on what
like
you
film in the
thought.
projector, the light matters a lot.
Yes. Yes, so it matters to have a document, but I've even called this the fateful illusion of modernism, that you could actually create a document that was self-interpreting, which is sort of the goal that the modernist, what we mean, the 18th, 19th century attempt was to create documents that were self-interpreting. They just meant what they said. And we now realize, I think we realize, at least I believe, that you can make documents that come pretty close to this. That's what makes a good scientific document. It comes pretty close to restricting the interpretation of a reader. But you can never achieve it, because the reader can always bring something new to bear on it. That's why the science can continue to grow and our discourse can continue to evolve.
Disambiguating via negativa.
Yes.
Yeah, in fact, just parenthetical for a second, I talked to a guy who's under contract from DARPA to develop a computer that can instruct itself via reading like a human being for the military in the United States. And so I was just interested. How are you parsing the challenges? And one of the challenges he brought up was that we take for granted that as we're reading, sometimes what we're reading will only bring about the comprehension we want or is required, because it's triggering the creation of mental imagery, and other times it's not. And there's no line that says when it's supposed to create mental imagery and when it's not.
No.
No,
quite
there's
interesting.
many different levels of challenge that we take for granted unless we try to take the problem
That's right.
apart.
Now look at the serious implications this has for our tests of literacy. Because, and I believe in such tests, I think they're quite useful, because otherwise how can you tell, and how can the learner tell how they're doing unless there's some objective indication that they're doing well or poorly. So I'm all in favor of using tests of this sort. But the illusion that test makers live in is that there is such a thing as the comprehension of the text, which is to say all readers will arrive at exactly the same meaning if they confront the same document. Well, it isn't true. But tests assume that it is. You see, if you didn't get the answer the test maker had in mind, you didn't understand it. Now, it's still useful, but you should realize the limitations of any of those kinds of devices.
Yeah, which reminds me of taking a driver's test recently. I mean, there, for example, they do expect they've got some synchromesh with your sense of the meaning of things, right?
Yes, and it's useful that they have. But it's very hard to teach them. It's very hard to teach adults in our society at all that the interesting thing about reading is the meaning that a reader brings, even if it's not exactly the meaning that the writer had in mind.
Which, of course, that spawned a lot of the whole language thought.
That's right.
That point right there. That's Goodman, isn't it? And he went off on that track. To some degree.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly you can say this, that the whole language people emphasized comprehension. So much so that they thought that decoding would more or less take care of itself, which is largely true, but it isn't entirely true. There are lots of things kids just don't notice about a script. At least some kids don't notice about a script unless you point it out to them and unless you show them how the script works in a particular
well, therein lies the rub, unless you show them how it works,
Yeah.
right? Let's go back in time a little bit to, there are some particular questions. And one of the things I want to give you an opportunity to do is, let's go back to bicamerality of the archaic versus classical Greeks that you mention in the book, and its connection to literacy.
This is the growth of subjectivity that you're referring to. I think that's a fascinating topic too. And the bold and brilliant idea was that people may have been talkers and communicators, but were so concerned with the effect that their utterances had on each other that they might have been really unaware of the properties of the utterances themselves. In other words, they weren't aware of the language. And that writing suddenly helped them realize they were talking. It was the writing that allowed them to realize, gee, I'm really talking. These are words. These are expressing thoughts and so on. So the invention of writing contributed to what we call the growth of subjectivity. People's ability to think about your own thoughts. Now, that theory, when it first came out, people like Onion's historians, and Julian Jaynes was the most interesting of these people, took the theory a little too seriously, I would say. By modern standards, we would say they overstepped the traces a bit. He thought there was no consciousness of language until you developed the ability to write. And that's probably not true. Probably consciousness of language comes along with speaking a language to some extent, because there are even meta-linguistic verbs that are part of ordinary everyday speech. Things like, what did you say? Did he tell you? Did he ask you? Was he honest? Was he joking? You know, all of these are meta-linguistic ways of talking about utterances, and they're certainly ancient, and certainly they exist in cultures without writing to this day. So there's a fair amount of meta-linguistic awareness in being a speaker in the first place. But I still think the theory about writing and consciousness is somewhat true, in that writing and reading makes you think about your thoughts in a deliberate kind of way that you just don't have an opportunity to do in your ordinary action and talking. I know that as a writer myself, I spend a lot of time just thinking about what's the right way to say that. I mean, I have lots of ideas. Everybody has lots of ideas, but I spend a lot of time saying, well, how would you say that? In the same sort of way that an artist looking at a tree might ask themselves, now how in the world would I catch that reflection of that light? And it depends on everything you know about your medium to know how you might go about doing that. Well, that's, I think, what happens with writing. When you become a writer, even when you learn to read and write, you begin to do this to some extent. But the more you do it, and the more you become a writer and a reader, the more you become conscious, not just of the way of formulating things, but of the thoughts that are expressed as you get a precise formulation. You see, as the wording becomes clear, the idea takes on a new saliency in it. So I do think that writing contributes to subjectivity. And in the literary theorists are dead keen on this. They talk about interiority, which they mean something like this notion that's nurtured in the mind by being a reader. The concept you get of yourself by putting your own thoughts into a book that you're reading. You know, that you get a kind of a mental life, a kind of interior mental life that you wouldn't get if you didn't become so involved in this literary tradition. And I think it's true, but that's the kind of theory that's hard to formulate and it's difficult to test and so on. So psychologists like myself love the idea, but are at a bit of a loss as to how to turn it into verifiable. Cash it out into scientific knowledge.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting line, and I'm sure literary theorists will take up that theme. But they, of course, tend not to talk to the psychologists.
Right,
so,
right. Well, I'm less interested in the black and white. I mean, I don't think that literacy causes this thing or causes that thing. But clearly there's some movement across the spectrum, and one end of the spectrum, we're more immersed in the flow. We're just flowing in the language exchange. And at another end of the spectrum, we're more distant observers, participants, critically aware of the motions and movements and whatever that are going on in that stream.
Yes.
And that this is the
Consciousness,
spectrum that literacy is affecting.
I think that's true. It doesn't affect everybody the same way. Like the thing that's a bit unsettling is that people can be quite highly literate and still use a very narrow gauge of interpretation. I would say fundamentalism is a bit like this. Fundamentalists can be very literate, very knowledgeable, but still have real strictures about interpretation. And then other people who may not even be as highly literate, may not have read as much, but somehow they've become more reflective about possibilities of meaning and interpretation and so on. And they recognize the richness and the possibilities of interpretation. And it's very hard to predict who goes one way and who goes the other. I would say that everybody in a school environment gets pushed to some degree, to a fair degree, to understand what documents mean, the possibility of misinterpretation, sometimes the possibility of rereading. But that's the rereading is hard to come by. Do you know what I'm saying? It's
Rereading.
easy. Means to say you could read that another way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the
Yes,
ambiguity.
right.
Recognize the possible ambiguity.
Right.
That a document could be read more than one way.
So that it's that you're not locked into a literal interpretation
That's
of what
exactly
it is you're
right.
reading.
Right.
That you're aware of the possibility of parallel, converging, connective
Right.
possibilities. And,
Yes,
yeah.
and that some documents may be even written to convey, to try to get the reader to realize there's more than one, or there's two or three, or there's kind of a depth, a bottomless depth to this document. You can think about it much further, much longer. Now, those are really cleverly written documents, but also takes a certain kind of prepared mind to see it. I remember teaching this poem in school. I taught school at one point, fourth graders for a year. And we had this poem called La Belle Dame Sans Merci. La Belle Dame Sans Merci. You know, the beautiful woman without mercy. But anyway, it's a very depressive poem. And every stanza ends with this refrain, and no birds sang. And I tried to teach the students, well, I said, what do you think that means? And they said, oh, it must be winter, the birds aren't singing, which is sort of a literal meaning. I said, that's true. Could it mean anything else? Absolutely not. And I said, well, could it mean that even if they were singing, he was so depressed that he couldn't hear them singing? No way, they said, no way. They had seized on a meaning, and that was the end of the story. They were only fourth graders, mind you. You'd hope by the 10th grade they'd realize he's not just telling you about birds not singing. I mean, who cares about that? He's telling you about the mood of this person. So there's kind of a development of recognition of depth in documents.
Good. Back in this early phase when literacy is coming on, one of the people that we've talked to has pointed out that in the conversation between Socrates and Plato about writing, that even as Socrates puts forth various resistive arguments to the march of literacy and what have you, that he's already using a language that's reflecting the effect of literacy on language.
Yes, this is entirely possible. Jack Goody, for example, has written quite an interesting argument that maybe Homer, the poet, had some acquaintance with literacy. It's possible, although the conventional assumption is that he was an oral poet, that it had been memorized for perhaps a century or more, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries before it was ever written down. But one could argue that there seems to be signs of literate practices even in the epics. And the same argument could be made about Plato and Socrates. But the people who've done the best work in this field, Rosalind Thomas, William Harris, and people like that, and Geoffrey Lloyd, who's extremely interesting classicist who's worked on this topic, say that the writing might have been important, but there are other extremely and equally important factors, like the fact that the Greeks were so argumentative. Anyway, Now, why they became they're so argumentative, whether it had to do with, I don't think it had much to do with writing at the beginning. But if you have the confluence of those kinds of things, they're already arguing, and then the argument becomes about did he say or didn't he say, and then documents come into play, and it does spiral out of control. I think the consensus is that the so-called Greek Revolution in argumentation, in theory of mind, theory of knowledge, all of that, wasn't exactly caused by the alphabet, although there are people who argued that, so much as the availability of a writing system just was exactly what was needed to make something out of that argumentative tradition anyway.
Tipped the watershed.
Tipped it, I would say too.
Yeah.
So this is the tricky thing about literacy. I would say that our society, and hopefully many of your panelists will disagree with this, that literacy tends to be overrated in our society. UNESCO too takes up, for example, the idea that education and literacy should be a universal human right. And I'm sympathetic to that. And literacy is so important that we should see to it that our schools do the best they can to see that kids become literate. I'm in favor of all of that. But the effort that we devote to literacy is often justified by invalid arguments. So people make monstrous claims for literacy that aren't justifiable. Claims about adult illiterates, and you'll have people who will comment on this because they work on this topic. But they tend to report huge percentages of the population as being functionally illiterate. But if you go and interview the people, so-called illiterates, very few of them say they have a reading problem. They do just fine in their work with the reading they can do. And if you actually go and ask 1,000 people with a slip of paper and a pencil, can you write? They can write lots of stuff. Very few people can't write a simple sentence, and they can read it back to you and so on. Minuscule, 1 or 2%, and they tend to be have rather severe disabilities. Most people have a bit of literacy, and it's plenty for them to get by. And some of us spend our lives in books. But the people who spend their lives in books, people like you and me, think that anybody who doesn't spend their lives in books must be some kind of an incompetent, mentally inferior person. I don't think they are. I think they're just the same as you and me.
The difference between being mentally incompetent or mentally inferior and having not being able to realize the potential in their lives because they didn't break through to a level of transparency with this.
Well, partly, but I would say the blindness it's more serious than the inability to say appreciate art and dance and so on. But it's more of that order of magnitude than of being something that really blocks you out from a broad range of experience. People watch movies more than they read books. There are all sorts of other media. And people can do the reading and writing they need to for their jobs, usually. And being able to read depends so much on which is back to where we started really, on what you're reading. I took a plane recently with my graduate students to New York, came back to Canada, we had to fill out the immigration form. I, a student of literacy, wanted to see how these highly professional people working on their PhDs, most of them, read a document like this that they'd never confronted before. Do you know how they did it? They'd talk to each other. They'd look this down. What does this mean? What does this mean? And they'd say, well, I think you sign here, but you print it here. All these sorts of things. Did we actually buy something that we have to declare? All of these things in filling out even a document depends on experience with the document. Being a good reader in itself doesn't get you very far. I said that incorrectly. It gets you a long ways. But it only gets you to the door of the uses of literacy for these various purposes that our society
necessary but insufficient?
Yes, necessary condition, but not sufficient condition. And what they need besides is to learn how to handle the kinds of documents appropriate to the life they live and want to live in the world they live in and so on.
And the question, though, becomes how much is their conception of the life that's possible and the life they want to live depending on how they feel about themselves, which is connected to how they came through this. I'm drawing this out here.
Yes, that's a good conjecture, and I am sure there are many people. There is, in fact, a novel written by Ruth Rendell of somebody who couldn't read and was led to all sorts of terrible things, and an even better novel called The Reader, about a woman who couldn't read and then was driven to incredible lengths in order to hide her disability.
Oh, I must tell you, we've interviewed the president of the International Reading Association, the president of Pro-Literacy. They've done study after study about the terror that adults live with as they go into supermarkets. I mean, in the American Medical Association, in conjunction with Pro-Literacy, there was a report that came out that people that struggle with literacy go to enormous lengths to hide it. So when you talk about what's going to show up from them about how they feel about their lives, to what degree are they going to disclose the degree to which this thing has hampered them?
Yes. Now, I think that's true. What one should have is a statistic on it, because what I take to be a fact of the matter about literacy is this enormous distribution in levels of competence. You know, the assumption, the generally held belief in educational circles, is that the variability of readers in a single grade is at least as great and maybe greater than the numerical value of the grade itself, which is to say, if you're a sixth grader, there's at least 6 years of difference between the best and poorest readers within the class. And these differences just increase. They are enormous differences. But the point is, that's normal. It's normal to have these enormous
But it's normal in terms of the historical unfoldment thus far. What else makes it normal?
Well, if it's just normal in the sense of if you take any other kind of competence, let's say the ability to shoot a hoop in basketball or to...
Just the bell curve laws.
Just bell curve laws. Now, you can spread that out by the test you're using. You know, it may be that the difference between the worst and the best readers doesn't amount to anything, but there's still 6-year grade levels of difference within a single grade. Yeah, but the span of the base of the bell curve would be, an artifact of all the different things that are in flux here, right?
Yeah.
Not just
not whether or not the organic human brain and the ability to read would necessarily distribute that way.
The difficulties in reading are very highly correlated, as you know, with social class and especially with poverty and things of that sort. And it's been argued, and I think it's an interesting argument, you could do more to improve reading scores by increasing the minimum wage by $1 than you could by adding summer school to the children's lives, because poverty contributes to bad reading. All these social factors contribute to poor reading.
As we discussed earlier, there's another argument that's coming in that says that socioeconomics is in itself a controlled secondary to language. That the degree of language exposure that children are having in the home has more of a correlate to their intelligence and their...
I'm sure that's true. But it's also true that in the Ontario studies, for example, the main factor that accounted for, one of the main factors that accounted for poor reading was how many times you moved house in a year. Poor kids move house. In the 19th century, something like 10% of the population were simply in motion all the time. Like in the school records, the children just going in and out of the schools, just moving around. Well, it's very hard to learn anything, let alone reading, if you're just in and out. Just the fact you're moving house.
No consistency.
No consistency, that's right. But certainly the language is very important. I'd say that it's an ongoing argument because I'm of the view that the reading difficulties involved in decoding a word, the so-called phonological awareness, is a different kind of phonological knowledge than the phonology you use for speaking. Now, some people think it's the same thing. Keith Stanovich tends to be, maybe I'm mistaken, but I believe I heard from Keith Stanovich that phonological knowledge is what matters. How good your phonology is. Yeah. But okay, I don't think it's true. It's a different kind of knowledge of phonology you need to be a reader. You have to analyze your phonology to
The
put
kind
it
of
into categories.
distinctions the brain has to make in order to track the differences and differentiate a sound in the soundscape of oral language is different than the kind of distinctions that have to be made if you're going to be able to take that and map it over to these print characters.
Exactly. For example, what you have to do to learn what the letter B represents in a printed word, you have to realize that the B is the thing that's equivalent to a set of words like bird, baby, bottle, and so on, all of which are very different. It's hard for, it takes a kind of analytical process to extract a feature of sound common to a bunch of words that could be represented by a single letter. And it's a big job. So there is an incredible amount of phonological analysis that's basic to reading. I agree with that completely.
Yeah. I mean, it seems in the soundscape of oral language, even though we're making those distinctions, we don't have to be conscious of them in the same way.
No, that's right.
Right? So even though the brain may be operating and recognizing distinctions in sound at the 10 millisecond level to be able to tell this word from that word, it doesn't have to rise to the same level of consciousness to be able to to operate, to function.
Right. Yeah. The way I've talked about this is that, and other people have too, is that reading is a meta-linguistic activity, which is to say you need the language, but you need a set of meta-categories, a set of categories for analyzing the language. Now, the analysis that's mostly studied in learning to read is phonological analysis, but it's also required for word analysis, to recognize that an utterance can be segmented into distinguishable words. And moreover, the dictionary intuition that namely there's a finite set of these. I mean, this was a major implication of literacy. The fact not just that sentences could be divided up into words, but that it's a finite list. Because there's not a finite list of sentences or utterances. They're generative, they are infinite. But there is a finite set of words. I think that's what made dictionary making feasible, made it a feasible task. So that's another implication of literacy.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Speaking of literacy, one of the points I want to make sure that we touch on, there's a few things. One was this remarkable statement you made in the beginning of your book, or page 143, the beginning of a chapter, having to do with the transition from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, being a reflecting that we came into a new way to read.
Right. Yes. Let's talk about this. This is very interesting, and I should present it as a universally agreed argument. There's a lot of evidence supporting this view, and I think it's one of the few coherent arguments, but it's still an ongoing argument. The thing that I noticed in reading this literature was that the development of modern science didn't just happen at a particular time. It seemed to me to be premised on what I called a new way of reading Scripture. Now, science and Scripture have always been treated as two quite different things. There is Scripture and a tradition of God-given authority and so on, and there's science, which is a collection of empirical knowledge. So, Snow's two worlds, two different sets of concerns. But the really interesting thing to me was that the church fathers, particularly in France in the 13th century, were the ones who started to take a naturalistic interest in reading of Scripture. Instead of feeling that when you're reading Scripture, God is talking to you, they started to read it as if it was written by a human being who was actually trying to tell you something. Now, you'd think that would be obvious all along, but in fact, it was like a revelation. And in my book, I tell how they went and consulted a famous rabbi of the period, Rashi, and said, how are you supposed to read these documents? And Rashi, of course, had a very naturalistic kind of reading and told them that they should ask questions like, well, who is he talking to? And what did he think was happening at the time? And who do you think he was writing it for? And all of these sorts of questions. And the church fathers then developed this way of analyzing reading texts in a kind of naturalistic, non-sacred kind of way, reading it as if it's a friendly letter from a friend rather than a word of God speaking directly to you. And when they developed this way of reading, of course, Luther picked it up. Luther, we tend to think Luther invented this, but of course he didn't. He picked up this kind of way of reading and said, that's the correct way. Well, of course, this horrified the church because the church had a monopoly on the correct way of reading Scripture, and they didn't want Luther or anyone else telling them the correct way to read Scripture. But the point then that this leads to is the idea that once you learn to read the book of Scripture in this kind of naturalistic, non-magical kind of way, you can also look at nature in the same sort of way. And in the 16th and 17th century, there was this metaphor about reading the book of nature, which we always just thought was kind of a poetic utterance. But they were quite serious about it. I think it was Thomas Brown, early 17th century, talked about reading the two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And then my argument was simply that if they had learned to read Scripture in this kind of way, reading nature in the same kind of way was kind of an obvious transfer of a tradition. And reading the book of nature was simply to not read nature as sacred, but to read it as natural, as worthy of describing, not see the magic, God's magic in creating nature, but just seeing nature more or less as it was.
Not so monolithically concrete. Something that you could dance with, you could think about.
That's right.
There was a multitude of possible interpretations rather than this concrete, uniform. It is so. That's that.
Yes. Well, the easiest way to say that is that if you think that God created nature for man's purpose, and if you think He gave you Scripture to instruct you, well, you read it and look at it in a certain way. And this is what they did. For example, they would find liverwort with leaves shaped like a kidney, and they would say, oh, that ought to be good for your kidneys. Herbal medicines and things of that sort. Because God created these just as He created Scripture, so you can see God's purpose in these things. Whereas the naturalistic way was to say, well, maybe God had a purpose here, but just look at it in its own right, more or less. What are the properties of these things? Do the properties conform to a rule or a natural law of some sort? So they search for relations, causal relations, or at least relations between properties, looking at the thing in its own right rather than as an evidence of God's gift to the world was what I think created early modern science. It's a way of looking at nature. They always had looked at nature, but they looked at nature in a new way.
Yeah, in less of a prescribed way.
Right, right. And not looking always for God's meanings in these
I never thought of that
objects.
before, but imagine that. You see, well, coming from this system, I look at this system and I see it through the lens of this one.
That's
and
right.
That on account of having a new way of thinking about this system, it changed the lens with which we look at everything.
At everything, yes. I think that's true. And I think the history of the document tradition is this way too. Once you have a documentary tradition for, say, law, then why not have one for school systems? School systems developed much later than legal systems. But as I was telling you about textbooks and record keeping and so on, counting the number of students in a school, keeping track of when they entered and when they left, keeping track of what exactly they were supposed to know at every point. Documenting everything was like a fetish that just spread through the whole culture. So I think the same is true of these modes of interpretation. You develop a mode of interpretation for looking at texts. You can also use that mode of interpretation for looking at nature, looking at science, and creating a new kind of discourse. Yes, I think that's fascinating, and there are many explanations for the rise of early modern science. Capitalism, for example, is undoubtedly part of the story. Mercantilism, new ways of doing the economy, all contributed to the rise of early modern science. But I think that at root is this tradition of reading, a way of reading. And then a way of writing follows from it. Once you start to read a certain way, you start to write that way. So if you read the written documents of, say, the early modern scientists, Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle, William Harvey, and people of that kind, you see the kind of writing they're doing makes the same assumption that I've claimed about their way of reading. Namely, just say exactly what you saw, why you thought what you saw, whether there was a relation between that and something else, and so on. A very down-to-earth kind of factual.
Subjectivity.
Yeah.
Tape
Yes.
Go. Okay. What we were just talking about the Renaissance and the beginning of modern science, of breaking free of a traditional assumptive set and having some freedom to kind of be more creatively perceiving what's going on, which just expanded and differentiated. Back at the point of that breakaway, what we're saying is that these systems became very rigid ways of interpreting, and that this is connected to your notion of script as model. Yeah.
Yes. The notion of a script as model is really the same thing that we were talking about, documentary practices flowing through the whole society, moving into entirely new domains. But I think that the beginning of this, the most formative aspect of it, was finding a way to write, inventing a script, and then using that as a metaphor, if you like, for thinking about other things. First, thinking about language, recognizing in speech properties that you were creating marks for in writing. This is a very important point. It was first raised by Roy Harris, that for the invention of scripts, that people didn't sit down and reflect on the properties of their speech and then find a mark for it. They just made marks that communicated and then tried to dissolve the ambiguity by giving further marks. So, now, it's not a fair comparison, but Hebrew, for example, tended, at least historically, to be written only with consonants, with the vowels left out. Well, why didn't they write the vowels? Well, because there was no need for it. There was no confusion in the document without the vowels. But when the Greeks took up that kind of a script, there were lots of words that differed only in the vowel sound. So it won't do to have an alphabet composed only of consonants. You try to hear other sounds in there that would distinguish the meanings, and those sounds tended to be vowels. So vowels get introduced into the writing system. So that there's this nice back and forth relationship between what you hear and what you're making the marks for. And I think this is true for children learning to read, that, you know, when they first start to write, this is well studied too, they first start to write, they do tend to just use a few consonants to represent a word. And if you ask them, well, do you hear any other sound in there? No, they don't hear anything else in there. But if you say, well, this says H-O-W rather than M-A-N rather than M-E-N. And then they will start to listen to the spoken sound, to the spoken form, and say, oh yeah, I hear that in there. I hear it, or I hear a T in there, or I hear a P in there. But they'll hear the sounds for which they have marks in the script that represent that sound.
A signpost for differentiating.
That's right. So their perception of their speech increases enormously by virtue of becoming writers. So there's this very interesting relationship between the phonological analysis you have to do to be a reader, which you have to do to some extent to learn some of the properties of the alphabet. But others you come to learn by virtue of having this model, the written script, and you have to listen again to the speech to see if there's any of those sounds that you had previously overlooked. And as you do this, your spelling improves, for example.
Right. And we're talking about two different related processes in that when I'm spelling, I can actually consciously mull it over. I can think about it. Well, how does this work? How does that work? When I'm reading, if that doesn't happen automatically, then my recognition of the word can take a left turn into the tank. I mean, right? That's happening automatically faster than I can pay attention to be able to make those marked differences give rise to a different word.
There's a very close tie between spelling and reading. It's true that you have to do this phonological analysis in order to recover a sound pattern, like in recognizing a word or reading it aloud. But and I should acknowledge that I think this is still controversial, that even when you're fairly good at that and can read a lot of words, you are not hearing all the sounds that those letters in the word represent at all. You may ignore a lot of them, and you can show this by showing that a kid can read a word, and then if you ask him to write it, a couple of consonants will just disappear, especially the N, like NT. At the end of the word, they'll just write T. They don't hear that N in there, even if they've been reading the word all along, because you don't really need to do such a full analysis of the word.
Boosting it close enough to comprehension to catch.
That's right. You just have to boost it to the point where you can grasp it and go from there. So when you try to write it, because you haven't heard that sound, it doesn't appear in your writing either. But when you learn the correct spelling, if you're fortunate to have a teacher that encourages you to do this, you start to say, yeah, I can sort of hear that in there. People will eventually say, yes, I can even hear silent letters, which is a bit of a joke, because of course there is no sound corresponding to a silent letter. But once you learn spellings, you almost think you hear them.
If you don't recognize a silent letter when you're learning to read, then you're in trouble.
That's right, because it distinguishes the word, differentiates the word. That's right. Yeah. So it's fascinating interplay. There's a very nice study by Amelia Ferrero, who's a very distinguished early literacy person. Have you ever heard of her?
I have heard the name.
She inspired some of our work, in fact, but she was a student of Piaget and did very nice work on children's early understanding of what a writing system is. And we followed up some of these kinds of work. If you, I think I mentioned in the book, there are examples like this. If you show children a card that has written on it 3 little pigs, did you come to that example? You say to children, what does this say? They say, it says 3 little pigs. And you then erase one of the words and you say, well, what do you think it says now? And many children, if they're pre-readers, they'll say, 2 little pigs? You see, because they think each thing is a pig. They're just marks for pigs. So there's used to be 3 pigs there, now there's only 2 pigs, now there's only 1 pig, because they don't realize at first that the script is representing their utterance. It's just pigs. It's just like a drawing.
The 3, yes,
yeah.
Yes.
And so then we did this clever thing with the one child. We say, well, can you write no pigs? And her eyes just went like this, She realized she was in a bind. She took her pencil, and instead of touching it to the paper, she held it about an inch in the air, and she went like this. And she said, there's no pigs, so I didn't write anything. So there's a lot of understanding about the relationship between writing, what it is, what it represents, how it represents. The children have to work their way into in the process of learning to read. Yeah, it's quite a fascinating
one of the distinctions that, like we touched on there, that's really important to what we're trying to draw out through conversation with neuroscientists and others is, though it's the same code, the mental processes involved, the kind of challenges involved, have some relationship, reading and spelling, but they're very distinctly different if you think about the processing challenges.
Well, it should be looked into. We have a great computational psychologist here in...
I'm going to pause this a second.
Okay. What, are we losing light, or are you losing energy? Computational psychologist here at the University of Toronto named Geoffrey Hinton, of whose work I'm a great admirer. And his computational theories are designed to reflect the fact that perceiving and performing are very much tied together. In other words, things like spelling and word recognition are very closely tied together. Now, if the neuroscientists don't show that yet, I'm sure they will eventually. That the very processes you use to create the scripts are the processes you use in recognizing them. Now, so far, I don't think this, in the neurosciences haven't captured that in any particular way, I don't suppose.
Here's the difference, for the clear difference that I think, is important to consider in that conversation is that if I'm trying to write a word and I don't know the spelling, I can stop and think about that for a while, right? Without the same danger of losing everything that if I don't, when I'm reading, that word is being assembled in my mind at a much faster speed than the conscious volitional participation that can go into figuring out the spelling.
Yeah, probably, to some extent anyway. But here's the empirical fact that psychologists will dwell on, is that that spelling and reading are very closely related. The children who can read can spell, the people who can spell can read. And the best, this is the Ferrero and Vernon data, the best indication of of what they know about the sound pattern in words comes from what they know about how to spell them, not from having seen a lot of words and recognized them. In other words, their knowledge is driven to a large extent by their writing, not just by word recognition reading.
Yeah, I would imagine that their explicit knowledge particularly is built more by the writing than the reading.
Anyway, it's a fascinating topic, and I don't really know much more about it other than these patterns of development in children.
That's good. So we've talked about writing bringing language to consciousness, which is a key piece. Mm-hmm. We've talked about the locutionary force. In our language, the affective carrier wave, what writing doesn't do.
Right. Yes, I think this is an interesting phenomenon. It has a great deal to do with the current issue in education about metacognition, the ability to think rather than just to know things. And the point about writing here is that in speech, it's quite easy to indicate to a listener how you want something to be taken. You can say things in an insistent tone, for example. You can say, it must be in that room. Or I could say, it's in that room. I don't even need to use a modal auxiliary, must be. I could just say, it's in that room, and a certain tone of voice will convey how I feel about it and what I want you to believe. But in writing, your resources are limited. You can't use gestures, and you can't use tone of voice. You can't use any of these paralinguistic clues to meaning, and you're forced to rely more on things like, well, engaging the trust of your listener for one thing, but also elaborating your utterances to say, well, I insist that you come in, or you say, I would suggest to you that you come in, or I promise you, or I think it's essential that, or could it possibly be? You get a full range of use of speech act verbs to indicate how you want something to be taken. The most important are these. Well, I think it's in the other room, as opposed to I know it's in the other room. Or because those are used in your own thinking. You see, what makes you a thinker is when you start to realize the things that you thought you knew are only things that you think or believe, and you need reasons for believing it. And are the reasons any good? That's all we really mean by metacognition, about thinking. So writing and literacy plays enormously into these reflective cognitive processes. Now, they are not exclusive to them, because you could teach people who couldn't read to talk and think this way. What you said about home language. For some families, this is the ordinary lexicon from time children are 2 or 3 years of age. Why should we do that? Some parents will say, is there a good reason? That's not a good reason. Or that isn't true. Or does that follow? I mean, there are all sorts of things you can put into the speech to your children, which are really literate practices, but children learn them through oral means. So this is another way that the literacy and orality are so completely tied up with each other.
Back to the distinction you were making a moment ago about literacy and orality. Of course, the other obvious thing is that if we're co-present, not only do you get my affect, which is the carrier wave of my verbal, if you don't understand something, you can ask me.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Whereas a writer, at least certain kinds of writing, if you're thinking of your reader and then thinking of more than one reader, you then have to take seriously, well, how will they read this, or how will they misread this? Yes, so that makes an enormous difference. As a matter of fact, I was going to say this when I said the two main properties of writing are through time and across space. But when you preserve it across space and through time like that, it puts it into the hands of people you didn't know were going to read it. And they are going to interpret it to their purposes. Sometimes that's just fine. But sometimes you as a writer know that it's going to go into hands of people that you don't know or that you might consider enemies. And you have to create a document that meets the needs of these possible needs of interpretation in other spaces, across space, in different places, and at different periods of time. So you get a kind of, I would say, discursive, prosaic kind of language, objectivized kind of language when you try to meet these constraints.
Which you almost back into science with all the caveats to make sure that nobody can misinterpret you because you've laid this framework.
That's right. And I think it was Robert Boyle who said when he wrote his scientific articles, he tried to write them in such a way that a reader would think he was right there beside you in the laboratory. And some other people have called this turning readers into virtual witnesses. It's as if when you're reading this, you're looking over their shoulder. Yeah, I can imagine. I can see what he would be doing there. Yes, I can imagine it. I'm a witness to this myself. You know, I'm not relying on authority or anything else. I'm just telling you what I saw. Here's what happened. When I made a vacuum jar and pumped the air out, feathers fell quickly or whatever in a vacuum jar. That's what you'd see if you were with me. You know, that's the way they're writing. I'm not trying to tell you anything.
Right. Of course, that may be
an illusion.
An illusion.
That's right.
Yeah, they're certainly telling you things, but they're posturing it in such a way as to make it appear not.
That's right. And they believed it was possible. I mean, that's what I call the illusion of modernism. They believed you could do it. And I have an example of this in my book about Bishop Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And there was so much dissent even in the Protestant church about what exactly Christians believed. So he said, well, I'll just write it down exactly what everyone believes, and then there'll be no further controversy. He thought it could be done. It became the common prayer. But, you know, he had no sooner written it than people started saying, yeah, but does this mean this or does it mean that? So, you know, they hoped it could be done. And science, I mean, the reliance on computers and on mathematics is in the hope that you could give the final theory. Although we know that, you know, any theory has assumptions that themselves can't be justified. You know, Gödel's so-called theorem and so on. You're always in a loop.
And yet we sit in a university, and while you're particularly more careful of this than most, there's this "it is so" tone that pervades the books, that pervades the language exchange that's common to the television and the newspaper and the radio and certainly the majority of rooms in this university, I would think, this carrier wave, this is the way that is.
Yes, yes. A kind of an official stance to it, you mean? A kind of objective stance to the things that are written?
Yeah, almost this, that's the way that is.
That's
this
right.
is the way this
yes,
is. It is so.
That's right. We once did an analysis of school textbooks for 6th graders, I think it was, to see what speech acts were used. They were all what we call assertives. They are just all telling you this happens and then this happens and this looks like that and then this looks like that. You know, it's all just factual, as if there was no ambiguity. There was no author even. These are just the way things are. This kind of objectivist, and people are rebelling against that. You know, they're trying to get more conversation into classrooms and acknowledge the fact that everybody has their own ideas anyway. So why not kick them around a bit and try to teach people how to judge these ideas and formulate them and evaluate them and so on, instead of just trying to memorize a fixed code, as we say.
This is a book, Lies My Teachers Told Me.
Yes.
Are you familiar with
Yes,
that?
I am.
It's right along these
Yes,
lines.
just,
I can remember reading this book. It wasn't until college.
Yes.
That I read it. And I just, actually I cried through some of that book, through
Yeah.
some of the things in history that were never presented in a way that this could have happened, or maybe this happened.
No.
It was,
And when you try to get more openness into a school system, this is in the US more than in Canada, there tends to be terrific opposition because they want the kids to be told the truth. They don't want any of this fuzzy boundaries of stuff. I can give you a case in point. Jerome Bruner, who's a friend of mine, developed a curriculum called Man, A Course of Study, which was more or less from an evolutionary point of view, which already made it a bit dangerous in some circles, but also encouraged children to think, well, why would Eskimos eat raw meat? Is this a good idea? Could it be done another way? It was really to encourage thinking, and then you form your own opinions, but you realize there's many reasons, and there's some reasons that are better than others, but it's much more open to discourse. But the state boards of education said, we don't want children to think about all this stuff. We want them to know the facts. We want certainties, not doubt. It's sort of tragic, but in fact, the schools are driven to this unequivocal stance.
Artificial premature certainty.
That's right, premature certainty, exactly.
Yeah, it was probably one of the single major turning points of my life. I think I grew up thinking somebody out there knows. Whatever it is, somebody out there knows.
I thought so too. I remember the first book I read in psychology, which the first question was about the mind-body problem. I said, I'm not going to read all this junk. I'm just going to look it up and see what did they decide? How did it come out? And then you realize, gee, they're still arguing about the mind-body problem.
That was exactly my point. As I went into when it was physics or archaeology or anthropology or whatever, the current state of it is an argument.
That's right.
It's a living argument, and yet out here on the surface, to schools and to the population, it is so.
Now, and I don't know how we have to get around this. You're raising a very interesting point. Science has thrived by being open arguments. Once an issue is solved in science, you just go to something else. You got to find another problem. But it's always ongoing argument and discussion. But in school, for some reason, I think it's partly a heritage of a scriptural ancestry. There is a premium put on certainties, on what's known and who knows it, and in such a way that you can be tested and held accountable for it. Now, how we are ever to shift that frame,
Well, if we don't start tracking learning rather than knowing.
That's exactly right. One of my friends says it's an epistemological issue. People think that knowledge is composed of certainties, which was once believed, of course.
My favorite example of that is Lord Kelvin.
Right. Oh, yes. There's some things that just can't possibly be.
Isn't it a fundamental disservice to education, to children, and I mean, how can you
think it
come
is
through this, and if you do reach the brink,
yes. Well, I have
say, hey, I've been cheated. Someone lied to me my whole time.
Yes. I have another book on this, called The Psychological Theory in Educational Reform. It's in here somewhere. I'll show you after a bit, because it does raise those kinds of issues. And the simple answer to your question is that schools aren't just run to be intellectually interesting for children, unfortunately. They are run to make children not cogs in a wheel exactly, but sufficiently socialized that they do all think in somewhat the same way.
Bots. Like robots, like bots.
That's right. Unfortunately, but that's true. I think this is what drove the move for textbooks that we talked about earlier. They want everybody to know exactly the same thing and be tested on exactly the same thing. This is another implication of literacy that we really must be aware of. That literacy makes it possible to organize bureaucracies of enormous complexities, put a man on the moon, but also bureaucracies to control knowledge. And schools are the institutions funded by the nation state to see that everybody becomes a good citizen, pays their taxes, will go to war if we decide you should go to war, will know more or less how to deal with the laws of the land, things of that sort. Not all of those are liberating. Some of those things are enormously constraining. So I'm alarmed when I see these comparisons of 41 nations on literacy tests. 41 different nations. All the children of 41 different nations can be given exactly the same test, and they're so similar that you can compare all these countries and say, well, Finland's a little bit ahead of Netherlands, and Netherlands a little ahead of Canada, and they're a little ahead of Saudi Arabia or something. I mean, it's terrifically constraining.
But when I pushed Vinesky or Reed Lyon or whatever on this point about the international comparisons, I said, do we really have a grid that differentiates the different kinds of ambiguities so that we're actually creating any kind of a test that could make such a statement?
Well, if you dumb down the test sufficiently, which is what they do, I think this is quite interesting. I mean, we could have this discussion. There's two possibilities here. One is that children are being made into replicas of each other in an incredibly remarkable way.
Social harvester.
More or less. The other is that if you give children this basic competence, they will use it in an incredibly florid and elaborate number of different ways, which is also possible. And maybe we're always thinking about a balance between these two things.
Or.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't like these international comparisons. I'd really like it if Dutch children were different than Canadian children in a lot of ways. If they want to come to graduate school in Canada, they're going to have to learn biology, to take this program. But it would be really nice if every kid in the Netherlands knew thousands of things about tulips, and Canadians knew only about alfalfa and
even that
wheat.
Still seems a bit nationalistic. I mean, I would hope that at some point children in the world will have environments in which they have an opportunity to discern their gifts, their passions, their interests, and that the education system meets them in that and builds a bridge between what they're authentically inwardly on about and what's necessary to function in the world in some balanced way that isn't so.
Yes, but you see what has happened in modern societies is that this rich possibilities of human beings is not really the agenda of the state schools. The real basic agenda, then you have to do these things or you won't get your diploma, is incredibly uniform across 41 nations. You have to be able to read a paragraph and pick its main point. You have to be able to know the difference between compare and describe in the instructions, You have to realize that an argument is complete, or, a few things of these sorts. Know the difference between quiet and laconic, a few terms to define and things like that. And
the last one being a vocabulary thing, but almost all of the former being the kind of meta-linguistic skills that we've been talking about all this time.
Yes, and the reading tests are sometimes, they don't acknowledge the meta-linguistic dimension of these tests, interestingly. It's the meta-linguistic dimension is usually just taken for granted. It just says things like underline the most important sentence in the text without being acknowledging that in fact the judgment about the most important sentence is a very high-level meta-linguistic judgment. So the tests are kind of meta-linguistic, but that's just part of the design of the test rather than anything that the children are taught.
Sloppy implicit.
Yeah, it's left in, sloppy implicit.
Oh, what a wonderful time. I could talk with you for days.
That's a very good topic.
Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, I meant to ask you, did you get that movie Luther?
No.
Gosh, I have to get that for you and send it to you. You're going to watch it.
I could just rent this at the...
at the local DVD place. You got to do that. I mean, given your...
in our conversation, I made some notes in my notebook, which I did bring in, but I think I haven't looked back through. Okay, but I won't forget this time.
All right. Well, given where we're coming from, and in the interest of time, I mean, I wanted to talk... Astington and you, the multiple choice tests to differentiate, imply, assert, meaning,
right.
This is connected to what you were just talking about.
Yes, it is.
Right? Let's bridge under that for just a moment.
Yes. All these meta-linguistic verbs, or most of them, tend to capture how you want somebody to understand what you're claiming. Like if you're going to say the ball is red, You want to say that you concluded it's red, or you want to say I'm insisting it's red, or I guess it's red, or I inferred that it's red, or my hypothesis is that it's red. I mean, there are lots of different ways you can indicate how you want something to be taken. And these all tend to be meta-linguistic kinds of concepts. They also tend to be fairly abstract, you'll notice. And what Astington and I did was just went around and interviewed, well, we gave these items to students, and then we went and interviewed some of the teachers. And the children in the academic stream were pretty good on these concepts. The kids in the general stream tended not to be. And the unfortunate thing was when we interviewed the teachers in the general stream said, oh, I wouldn't use words like that with my kids. They wouldn't understand them. Which is just like saying, you know, I have a prize here for you, but you can't have it. You know, it's a real disservice. They're trying to be good to their students, but when you limit the language, you limit the world. And this kind of rich language is really essential to
If I had $1 for everybody, from everybody who said, well, I understand that, but nobody else will, which is related to what you're saying. Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. And that is so true of teachers. Well, I thought that was really important and kind of...
an impact of literacy. It's a kind of a broadened use of literacy for thinking. You know, there's a nice expression that Dan Slobin has used that helps in this discourse too, and the question about thought and language has always been asked, well, do you think only in terms of the concepts you have available, or can you sometimes think outside of the concepts you have available, and so on? And basically it's known that the bigger the vocabulary you have, the more distinctions you can make in your thinking. But it's a very tricky domain to sort out the relationship between language and thought. And Slobin said, well, don't phrase the question that way. Think about what you have to, about thinking for talking. Because there you do have to shape these impressions into an utterance, which is a very high-level cognitive act. You know, the thoughts in your head aren't really verbal thoughts, by and large. They are just impressions. And so turning them into an actual expressible verbal form takes a kind of thinking, an important kind of thinking. And I would just add, then it's the same for writing. That maybe shouldn't ask so much about writing and thinking, although you can talk about that to some extent. You could phrase it usefully as saying, how do you think for writing? And then you come up to questions like we discussed earlier. Can you say she here, or do you have to say Miss Jones? You know, because you do have to think about your audience, about what the audience probably knows, about the point you're trying to end up with, and all of those things when you go to write that you don't necessarily have to confront when you're talking. You know, somebody can ask you to say more if they don't understand, and so on.
Right. Or when you're talking to yourself, which is entirely different because you don't have the same degree of social consensual stuff going on. As you make the difference you were making between the thoughts swirling around in me and then speaking.
Finding the form.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think artistic metaphors are pretty good. You know, artists say too that there's an object, but you have to find a form to represent it. Or it's a nice sunset, but what colors do you use to represent it? You know, you have to draw on your so-called vocabulary forms. You have to find a way to put it into your categories in thinking to talk, or thinking to write, or thinking to draw, or to paint, or anything else.
This is where Stennett would say your vocabulary is the toolbox.
Yes.
You touched briefly on the Greeks adding the vowels, back on the history track.
History of the alphabet.
Yeah. We talked to somebody who relative to the Hebrews, said that, you know, the reason that they didn't put it in was that it was the vowels were the breath, and you couldn't make an image for the breath. It was sacrilegious. It was just not something you could do. So they had a certain restraint on them at that level, and then the Greeks come in and instrument it in a way that reduces the ambiguity, right? Concretizes it more. But they don't have punctuation. I mean, there's a story of the unfoldment.
That's exactly right. There's an enormous story. Like the invention of punctuation is even a modern invention. Learning things like capital letters at the beginning of a sentence. You know, this is not a simple enterprise, nor was it a simple invention. Putting words spaces between words. Do you know, there's very nice work on writing in the 10th and 11th century that they just ran it all together, maybe to save space or whatever. But then about the 11th century, in order to aid reading, the argument is to aid silent reading, which is a very interesting idea. It helps enormously to have spaces between the words. If you're just intoning along phonologically, say reading orally, you can actually do it fairly well. Just look at each letter sequence and rhyme it off.
Code cued speech.
Right.
So long as there's not a lot of ambiguity in letters and sounds.
Right.
Which is what comes to be our sort
now,
of
there were some studies done by Michael Cole and Sylvia Scribner in the 70s on readers in the Vai, an African tribe that had their own writing system. And it was a syllabary. But to me, the interesting thing about the writing system was that you could only read it aloud. And there were no spaces between their words. They really just they had learned a script for transcribing what they thought the sounds of their speech were in a long continuous string. But to read it, they would read it aloud over and over again until they got a phrasing that they recognized. Oh yeah, he could be saying that my sister in the valley as well, you know, something like that. But they'd read it aloud over and over again until they could hear
kind of adjusting the tape, so to speak, until it popped in.
That's right. So there's another kind of reading, really. You can get some aspects of the phonology, but until you know which phonemes go with which words, you don't have very much. So that's what they're doing, presumably, and reading it again and again is finding, well, really the grammar. What's the subject? What's the predicate? And that sort of thing. So the issue of silent reading is extremely interesting as well. Like in our society, silent reading seems to be a perfectly natural and preferred function, but that's a modern belief. You know, reading even in the 19th century used to often be oral. Even when you're reading books, people would get in a circle and read to each other, read it aloud. Because the experience of reading was kind of a communal activity. So this is why I say the new frontier is really this history of reading. People read in different ways for such different purposes, probably all with different cognitive implications. And it's not really well studied, certainly not by psychologists as far as
and it's a story that bears on psychology, it's a story that bears on culture, it's a story that bears on technology. It's all these different dimensions that we've just kind of taken it for granted as the background noise.
We take it as if it's natural. As I've been writing about schooling recently, as I told you, and the most remarkable thing about schooling is everybody thinks it's just such a natural phenomenon. You know, it's just like drinking water. Of course you have school, you drink water, don't you? But of course it's a social invention which was premised largely on writing, on documents, on the assumption that knowledge is in books and children should have access to it, and that you could organize the practice of schooling through creating an organization, a bureaucracy based on documents and books and so on. It's very recent and artificial construction.
I think it's so important. For a long time, I've talked with educators over the past 20 years, and it's really remarkable what's considered technology and what's not. Like, you know, a book's not technology, but a computer is technology, and a television or a radio is not. It's not the same thing as a computer, but I mean, this artificial environments that, you know,
now
we're all bled together.
Yes, and the issue of what is technology, what is a technology, is vexed, of course, just as what is a medium, you know, because the boundaries are, well, they slip around a bit. And I do think that it's now part of everybody's vocabulary, but as you say, in schools, the media is thought of as electronic, not as, you know, the media, we always had like a blackboard. A blackboard is probably the most important, or a slate, you know, that children wrote on, because you could have writing. You see, you could have literacy with slates and blackboards. That's probably the most important technology that ever hit the school, certainly. Printed textbooks.
Post-printing press.
Oh, yeah, setting aside printing press. I mean, no question, the printing press was, the slates were used because there was a at least there were writing systems. The printing press made so much printed material available and inexpensive, that then it really was in everybody's interest to learn to read and write. And you know, this function in Ontario here, but it's the same in the US, was not considered a state enterprise till about 1807, I think, was the first bill ever passed in the legislature to say, no, the state has an interest in education. We'll give you money if you'll teach the kids. Before that, lots of people could read, but their parents taught them, you know, or the church taught them or something. In 16th century Sweden, practically everybody was illiterate, even if there wasn't much of a printing press, because there were printed Bibles, of course, because the local priest would go around and see that every child in that family can read the confession before they could be baptized or whatever this
condition of participation
yes.
in the religion.
So they were all literate.
Can you speak more to any numbers in
In
give people an idea
Historical.
of historical numbers in different centuries of how many people were reading versus when we look today to how many people read. It's a magnitude of order.
Yes, it is an order of magnitude. But the remarkable thing is how many people could actually read and write, even when there were no schools and nobody paid any attention to it. But it developed mostly with the cheap printing press, like in Britain, in the end of the 17th century. The printing press made cheap books that even poor people could buy, and they created a new genre, you know, the romance literature, penny dreadfuls as they called them and so on. And even a big percentage of poor people could read those things.
This is a hockey stick, like, and we're talking about 1 or 2% or some small percentage of the population, and then the technological enablement that kicks it up to...
Yeah, but the people have actually calculated what percentage of, say, the classical Greeks could read and write. And I think it was only something like 10 or 12% they figured could read in Greece, in classical Greece, which is quite a lot of people. But it's certainly not a mass effect. And in the, through the later Middle Ages, upper class children and the children of aristocrats could all read and write. You know, they hired tutors and had their children taught. It became middle class with the growth of middle class, you know, petty bourgeois, then shopkeepers and things like that. Then they wanted their children to read, but they saw to it themselves, paid for the children to be taught or taught themselves. There are many autobiographies of people who were self-taught. They went to school for just a few days to see what the alphabet was about, and then practiced up on their own and became prodigious readers and wrote autobiographies. I couldn't give you the name offhand, but I could look them up for you. There's a famous old book, well, many books. Ian Watt's book called The Rise of the Novel is a history of this readership. Queenie Leavis in the 1940s wrote a book called The Rise of the Reading Public, because that's how literacy became a mass enterprise. And then once a lot of people were doing it, it just seemed more convenient to put them into, you know, family or community schools, usually paid for still by local parents and so on. But in 1807, as I say, the first bill was passed saying, oh, we'll take over. And of course, when they took over, they said, you'll read this and this.
Yeah, how do we control and manage it and make it...
That's right. And by 1850, I was telling you, every child in the 4,000 schools in Ontario were reading exactly the same books. Those same 4 sets of readers. They're published by the big department store here in Toronto, T. Eaton Company. Quite phenomenal. And you can see, and it's always just written in the history as progress. Look at the progress of spreading literacy. It is progress. But you can see the enormous homogeneity being created through these, you know, because everybody suddenly needed access.
And now this has resulted in a world in which a certain level of literacy, higher and higher levels of literacy are necessary in order to function.
To function in some roles. Not every role. Like, you know, in Ontario, we just had a report that said 70% of the new jobs being created require post-secondary schooling. Everybody quotes a figure like that. I don't know where they get the figure, and I don't believe it. Because I've read other reports that say that about 70% of the jobs are in the service industry. Catering, restaurants, parking attendants, taxi driving.
But how many kids when they grow up say, I want to be a taxi driver, or I want to be work at McDonald's the rest of my life?
I'm not saying who wants it. I'm saying who does it.
I understand, but I mean, so...
But who does it is predominantly those who have not developed higher literacy skills that would enable further opportunities.
That's right. So, but you see the bind here. I would say that, just as a guess, at least 50% of the jobs require low levels of literacy. Some literacy. I think I certainly agree that you can't live in a literate society like this and really feel in the least bit at home without being literate. Maybe the same is true for speaking English. There's enough local communities of Hindi speaking and Cantonese and so on that they might feel at home in their communities. But to be at home in Canada and feel like you're Canadian, I think you have to speak either French or English. But the same is true for literacy. To be at home in a literate society like this, you have to have a fairly decent degree of literacy. But as I quoted Tom Stitch for saying, most people in Canada, if they've been to school for at least 6 or 7 years, which they have to by law, can read pretty well. They're just not great readers. So the people who need high levels of literacy, they tend to be the professions. They always were. The people who were highly literate in the Middle Ages were the people in the professions, the law and the church. When the professions increased, medicine, law, when they added further professions, more literacy was required. Now everybody wants to be a professional. That's where the money is, we say, or business at least. And for play any role there, you have to be pretty competent, not just as a reader, but some computer skills now too, and fairly high levels. I agree.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, can the whole the skills and mechanisms involved in literacy become transparent to enabling you to learn what you want to learn to go where you want to go in your life?
I think that's the goal, and I endorse the goal completely. But I would also put a qualifier. To be harsh, I would say it's naive to think that you can bring everybody into that domain. Some people are just not very good readers. Even if they can read, they're just not great and they don't want to spend their life doing it. They'd rather do something else. Sure. Because the thing that's normal is this enormous diversity. You can be a perfectly good functioning person.
We don't say that about walking.
We do, actually. You don't need to be a great walker. There are great walkers. These guys can walk 15 miles.
But if we looked at the bell curve of great walkers versus walkers, it wouldn't be so...
It'd be bigger.
It would?
Oh, I think so. There are some people who shuffle. Look at me. I'm now 69 years old.
But in terms of the functional ability to move through space in order to...
but everybody can read that well.
Everybody can read that well?
Everybody can read that well. A very good question. So let's not decide on it. But one should think of reading as a kind of skill analogous to painting or maybe not walking, but at least jogging and running. Playing a sport, playing video games, lots of skills. And the fact about humans that makes them interesting is that we're not all the same. And some people do things amazingly. The Beijing circus is in town this week. Yeah, they are amazing, yeah. Totally amazing. Well, that's just to show the distribution is enormous. Now, most people, we do have an obligation to see to it that children are given access to this important resource. I'm completely with you there. But it is naive, as I think the No Child Left Behind legislation implies. You're just going to move everybody up, and they'll all be good readers. What you don't want is that only the poor kids can't read. You have to do something about that. You can't leave it so that only the poor kids can't read. But you do have to admit that even when we're readers, there's still going to be this enormous distribution.
Let's
it's
get
just
there
fine.
And figure out what it is.
Well,
get closer to there and figure
let's
out
get
what
closer.
Yeah.
I certainly think we need to. We already know what we need to do to make it so that poor, disadvantaged children would have a better chance of becoming readers. But it's costly and it takes years. As I told you, this high scope program that makes these kids indistinguishable from middle class kids takes about 15 years. It's not something you give them in summer school, and it's not putting screws on a teacher. it's really providing resources needed and the backup they need so that they can become just as competent as they want to be or need to be to enter, various professional or other occupational roles.
Good. We end with that? I think so. Excellent.
Was it good enough?
That was great.
Great.
I
Well, it was
appreciate
fun,
it.
wasn't it?
It was a lot of fun.